Welcome to my podcast. This is called All Reading Matters, because, well, it does. Now, some of you may recognise the voice. I've been around for quite a while online, do a few radio shows and stuff. But one of my passions, apart from obscure Finnish prog rock music from the 70s, is reading. I make no secret about that. And I thought it would be nice to actually do a podcast about some of the books that I read, because I get through an awful lot of books, and they're all about different things. Sometimes I'll read a few books on one subject, and other times I'll be a little bit of a grasshopper and skip from fiction to weird things to biographies, historical, you name it, I'll read it. I wanted to share the passion that I've got for reading. And I thought a podcast would be quite a good idea. I sat around thinking, how am I going to do this? What am I going to talk about? And I came to the conclusion that the best way to introduce it was to tell you a little bit about me, what I love about reading, and start off with some of the books that I've read and talk about them. And I hope to expand this in time to cover specific areas and do little podcasts on a group of books, a particular topic, a particular author, a particular subject. Who knows? I don't. I'm just making this up as I go along, really. But as long as it's all about books. And hopefully some of you listening will get in touch and you can talk to me about the books that you read and disagree with what I've said. Tell me if you've read the books. Tell me books that you think I should read. So, where do we start? Oh, well, some of you may know me as the God of Thunder, some of you may know me as Mark, some of you may know me as Dr. Sweatshirt. Oh, God, I've had loads of different names. For about 4 years, I replied to anybody who addressed me as Mitch. It's a long story, we don't want to go into that. One of the things that I've always been very, very passionate about is reading and books. I love my books. I can't stop buying books. If I have an addiction, it is to buying books. Now, some of you may see that as, you don't need them, you could always sell them when you've read them. Oh, wash your mouth out. How dare you? The Japanese have a phrase for it, tsundoku, and it's a concept of buying books, being surrounded by books and the pleasure that gives you. Not necessarily because you intend to read them straight away, but just being surrounded by them makes you feel better, it gives you pleasure. And I get that. I buy books when I'm passing, maybe a shop, maybe it's an online website, or I get sent an ad from a bookseller, and I'll see a book and I think, oh yeah, I'll get around to reading that one day. And I may do. I may die long before I get to half the books that I haven't read yet. Even so, just having them and knowing that at any point, if a mood takes me, I can go and get a book off a shelf and read it, that gives me a kind of strange pleasure. Maybe that makes me weird. I am weird, I admit it. But that's just the way it is. Other book lovers will know. They will understand. If you're a book lover, you get it. Why did I start reading? Well, I blame my mum. You see, when I was a child, I was about 4 years old. My mum, and I thought about this, and I don't really know why, because my mum never showed any technical expertise in anything, really. She was an artistic person. She was a creative person. As far as technical things like, electronics, and this is talking back in the 60s, it was kind of primitive. But for some reason, my mum bought a Philips reel-to-reel tape recorder. And she read onto this some books. And at 4 years old, she taught me how to use this, how to play it back, so that I could listen to the books. So by the time I started school, at age 5, I could already read. And my mum got a good shouting at from the headmistress for teaching me to read, and all the damage that was going to do to me and their system and everything. Yeah, okay. I could already read by the time I went to school. I did not like going to school. I did not like it one little bit. In fact, I think I cried for the first week. I say cried. I mean howled. I mean screamed. Even more than when they went to take me to the barber's to have my hair cut. I absolutely screamed the place down. The only thing that they could do to pacify me was to put me in the library. Now bear in mind, I was 5 years old. This was a school library, and it's 1968. So I'm sat there, and in the few minutes that I've actually stopped crying and screaming, and probably kicking and biting as well, I took a look around. I didn't really know what possessed me, but I guess I got up and had a look at the books on the shelves, and I remember it clearly. The first book that attracted my attention. And having researched it in more recent years, I realise now that the book that I picked was actually new. And it was a book called Nuvolari and the Alfa Romeo. And there was another one, Jimmy Murphy and the Duesenberg. These were books that had illustrations, actually by Raymond Briggs, although I didn't know who the hell Raymond Briggs was at the time. But there was something about these books that spoke to me. Now you've got to bear in mind that my first words were cars. I think my first words were probably something like Ford Prefect or Anglia. And then I sort of progressed on to Jet and Esso and Shell. And those were the first words that I spoke. I learnt from motor cars and petrol stations. But yeah, the first book I remember reading was this book, Nuvolari and the Alfa Romeo. Illustrations, as I said before, by Raymond Briggs. And I must admit, Raymond Briggs would go on to become one of my favourite artists in later years, but more of that to come at some future date. The text was by a guy called Bruce Carter, and I have to confess that as I am recording this, I am waiting for it to arrive sometime in September. I actually tracked down a copy of Jimmy Murphy and the Duesenberg and Nuvolari and the Alfa Romeo by Bruce Carter, and I paid $53 for the pair. And I'm waiting for them to come. So when I do get them, we'll do a podcast on those because it's 60 years since I last read those. And I do remember nobody else got a look in. I wouldn't let anybody else anywhere near those books. But that's what started me. I've been an avid reader ever since. I also remember another one of my favourite books was The Little Grey Men by B.B. I've reread that one fairly recently, and it's still got a magical book as well. I read all the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I loved them. Reread them recently as well. And they're still rather wonderful, although I am a bit puzzled by all the hoo-ha going on around them in this woke world that we live in the 21st century. I don't quite get it, but, you know. The next book that I really remember reading was Dracula. Now, I guess my interest in Dracula must have stemmed from seeing the film. We're talking the original Universal version with Bela Lugosi. Must have been on the TV back in the 60s or early 70s sometime. I do remember watching a load of B-movies, things like The Snorkel and The Giant Claw, and the original Universal movies, the Dracula, the Frankenstein, Mummy, Wolfman, all those things. And they sparked an interest in old horror movies. And people like Lugosi, Karloff, Lon Chaney, which persists to this day. And I remember being about 11 years old and going into W.H. Smith's in Harrogate, where we lived at the time. And I found a collection of Bram Stoker, which had Dracula, Dracula's Guest, The Jewel of the Seven Stars, The Lair of the White Worm, Lady of the Shroud. And I bought it. And I read Dracula. And I loved it. I still love it. I read it probably about once a year. And I have quite a few different versions of it. I've got a version, Dracula or the Undead, the original stage play that Bram Stoker created to seal the copyright. I've got 3 or 4 different versions of it. And I just love the way that he wrote it, the language that was used, the characterizations. And it is, to this day, probably my all-time favourite book. There was also Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I got into Edgar Allan Poe. And it's sort of the whole horror thing, which has also gone on into the movies, and I've got loads of movie books about it, particularly things like the old Universal horror movies, the German expressionist movies of the 1920s, The Silence. We'll come on to that in a future podcast, I'm sure. One of the other things that I started reading very early was science fiction, particularly John Wyndham. I came across The Day of the Triffids, and I just loved the way that he wrote. It was 1950s style. It was just quite delightful to read. The language, the way it was written, just the idea appealed to me. The time it was written in, it was different to what I was used to in the 70s. It was, even then, it was like a former time, a different world. Kind of like the old films that you watched on telly. I went through pretty much everything that John Wyndham wrote. The Chrysalids, the Kraken Wakes, the Midwich Cuckoos, and even other things like The Sleepers of Mars, Jizzle, all those odd little books. And then I sort of also was heavily into Jules Verne, Journey to the Centre of the Earth, and The First Men in the Moon, and 20,000 Leagues, all those kind of things. They just appealed to me. I was heavily into comics and monster movies and sci-fi movies, and I loved all those things, and that was just part of it. So there's quite a lot of science fiction in my library. Of late, a lot of the books that I read tend to be sort of hundreds of pages long and quite tricky to get through. Now, for example, the one that I'm reading at the moment is a book by David Talbot called The Devil's Chessboard. It's all about Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles and their rise to power, and they were bad men. They really were bad people. And, in these podcasts, we'll get into things like that, some of the weird books that I've read. My bookshelves are books. Now, that is mostly fiction. They're just sort of normal books. Then there are the other books. Now, these are the ones that contain some unusual concepts. You might call them conspiracy theories. They're also books about things like Gutzon Borglum and his carving of the heads Mount Rushmore, The Fall book about Robert Maxwell, Lost Boy about the Moors murders, stuff like Manson, Jack the Ripper, you name it, there's something for everyone in there. I've also got a few books on the JFK assassination, got everything that John Hamm has written. We'll get into that. Then there are books that I've put in the travel section. Quite a few of these are books that are written about people taking motorcycle journeys around the world, which is something that I always wanted to do, but I fear now that I'm too old and it will never be something that I do, so I enjoy reading about it. But there's also Neil Peart's books after his family died and he got on his motorcycle and started riding. Ted Simon's books. Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman, Long Way Round, Long Way Down, and Simon Gandolfi's book. And he's someone who I can relate to, Old Man on a Bike. Now, you see, I never took my bike test when I was young, but it's something that I thought maybe I should do now. And then I think, well, the state of the roads now, I don't know whether I want to. But then I think, I don't know, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. And now I'm thinking, well, unless I make a load of money out of this podcast, I can't afford to. So maybe that's something that I could do. I've got books on motorsport. Motorsport is something that I'm quite passionate about, particularly NASCAR. I've got quite a few books on NASCAR and its history. And also Formula One, and before that, the history of Formula Racing, Grand Prix automobile racing as it used to be known, dating back to Nuvolari, people like Fangio, Rudolf Caracciola, Bernd Rosemeyer, the Silver Arrows of the auto unions, and the Mercedes in the 1930s. In motorsport terms, that was an amazing era that a lot of people don't even know about. And there's a lot of stuff that I'd want to talk about. People like Jimmy Clark and Jackie Stewart, Graham Hill, James Hunt, Niki Lauda, right through to the modern day people like Gilles Villeneuve, even people like Damon Hill and Senna, Michael Schumacher, even Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Raikkonen, and right up to the modern day. Although there aren't so many books about modern day. We're also talking people like Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley. Let's get into that. There's all sorts of motorsport-related items that I want to do podcasts on. Movies and TV. Oh, you name it. Everything from biographies of Mary Pickford and Erich von Stroheim through Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Christopher Lee, the horror films of the 1930s, and the horror movies of the 20s, silent films, Bogart, Bacall, D.W. Griffith, Lon Chaney, Hollywood Babylon, Shepperton Babylon, all sorts of stuff in there. And even up to fairly modern day stuff. Well, it's not quite so modern day. Randall and Hopkirk Deceased. Things that I watched when I was young through things like Only Fools and Horses, Black Adder, Father Ted. I've got loads of books that I'm just dying to talk about. I seem to have an awful lot of music biographies and autobiographies, and also books about music, the business, the producers, how things were made, DJs, and also I've got quite a sizable selection related to blues, the history of the blues artists. There will be podcasts on that. I have many music biographies, and I'll be talking about some of my favourites, and particularly I have a few that relate to Alice Cooper, but also people like John Heisman of Colosseum, Jack Bruce, Jeff Beck, the stalwarts of the rock music scene over the years, but even people like Johnny Taylor, Dennis Coffey, P.P. Arnold, Duke Fakir of the Four Tops. I've got a wide variety of material to talk about. My interest in music is quite wide-ranging. I also have a small collection of books on magic, covering people like Houdini, Howard Thurston, Chung Ling Soo, the Masculines, and also a couple of books on the history of magic, the art of illusion. It's something that interested me from being a young age. When I was a child, my parents ran a small guest house in Harrogate in Yorkshire. And for a couple of years in the mid-70s, a group of magicians from Glasgow used to come and stay with us. That is what sparked my interest in magic. I was just fascinated by the way they talked about it. And to me, knowing how an illusion is performed, that doesn't spoil it. I like to watch things and think, do you know, I know how it's done, but I still can't see it. I will be talking a bit about magic at some point. So I have rattled through some of the books that I've got and hopefully given you an idea. I don't expect everyone to be interested in everything, but hopefully some of you will share my passion and my enthusiasm for certain areas and certain books. Hopefully you will find something of interest in the podcasts. Maybe it'll turn you on to a book that you never thought of, give you an interest in something that you hadn't even considered. At the end of the day, all reading matters.